All right. Matt Castino is the marketing measurement lead at Canva. Matt's background comes from both academia as well as industry. He has a PhD in behavioral neuroscience, and he now applies his extensive expertise in statistical analysis and human behavior to help drive data-driven decision-making in marketing at Canva. In today's episode, we had a great conversation touching on experimentation, how to get buy-in from your organization about incrementality, Canva's branded search, and whether or not it's actually driving incremental subscriptions or not. The surprisingly hardest part of actually having a media mix model, communicating trade-offs to the finance team, marketing measurement when operating in 15 countries, and many, many, many more things. Please, please, please give it a listen. I hope you really enjoy it. Super educational, both for practitioners as well as for people on the data science and statistical modeling side. Matt was super insightful guest. Hope you enjoy the conversation. Maybe just to start, tell us about your role. What do you do? Why are you on a marketing science podcast here?
Yeah, so first of all, thanks for having me on my show. Really excited. Thanks for having me on the podcast. I'm really excited. So a few years ago, Canva went down this path of revisiting how we think about measuring marketing performance. And we underwent a big shift in our thinking and our approach in how we do this, right? So we used to think quite a lot about, historically we've done things around using attribution-like frameworks for measuring marketing performance and using that to make decisions. And about 3 years ago, we went through a big philosophical shift in how we think about this and started to go down the path of really focusing on approaches that led us down the thinking about measuring incrementality, right? And as part of that, we created a designated team within Canva's marketing data science team called the marketing measurement team, which I lead. And that team has a pretty simple goal to help Canva maximize its return for every single dollar of ad spend that we put out there, right? So I lead that team, and as opposed to being aligned to a particular marketing vertical like brand marketing or performance marketing or lifecycle marketing, we're sort of positioned horizontally across all of marketing across Canva. So we run modeling and experimentation to help different verticals within Canva measure their performance and improve their impact, essentially. So yeah, the team's about 2 or 3 years old now, and just really enjoy working on really interesting problems and sort of like, it's been a journey, right? Like we've gone from like literally the start and, trying to think about like how philosophically do we want to do this? How do we want to think about marketing measurement, and then go through the process of actually implementing it, scaling it, refining it, getting better. And so it's been an exciting journey.
It sounds amazing. You are right that there's no shortage of interesting and challenging problems to work on in marketing science and marketing measurement. Curious, was there like a catalyzing event that caused the creation of this team? Or I think, a lot of our listeners are probably like, man, I wish our company had a team like this. But like, so how did you get there? Or like what caused the team to come into existence?
Yeah, interesting. To be honest, I can't claim credit for that, which is fine. So the catalyst was a person, right? So we hired someone, Sam Redfern. He came from Facebook, where he spent a lot of time helping companies build measurement solutions. And he came on board 3 years ago, and he really drove this change within the organization. So he really fought for it, spent a lot of time advocating for it, and coming up with this framework of how we should think about marketing measurement, right? So he was the initial advocate for this solution, right? And he's still at Canva, obviously. He's gone to bigger and more interesting things. And over the past couple of years, I've been kind of the person that's really led and driven the implementation of this way of thinking and scaling this way of thinking across the organization, and getting leadership buy-in, thinking about all the different ways we can use this data to make good decisions. But yeah, I guess like the catalyst for this change was just a new thinker, right? And I think that, every organization can benefit from bringing in people from the outside who think about things in a different way, and then are just really effective at driving change.
Sounds amazing. You mentioned the word incrementality. Well, you mentioned a couple of interesting words. You mentioned one word, incrementality, and another word, framework. Can you tell us about like, what is the incrementality framework at Canva? Like how have y'all brought that to life and are actually using that to drive value?
Anyone who knows me or anyone who knows the people that have been involved in this for the past few years knows of what we call the pizza analogy, the pizza shop analogy that we use. Like whenever we're presenting this to someone new, we always show this one slide in a slide deck, right? And essentially what it shows is this visualization is it shows two cars driving along the road, passing a billboard advertising 2-for-1 pizza, right? And there's a pizza shop in the distance. And the first car, it says next to the first car, was already driving to the pizza shop. And the second car, it says, decided to stop at the pizza shop because they saw the billboard, right? And when we try to explain to people that how we think about incrementality, like the philosophy, the framework, right? It's that, basically these traditional attribution style frameworks will tell you that two people saw the ad and two people went to the pizza shop. Therefore, we drove two conversions, right? But we know that many people just do stuff, right? They see ads and then they sign up. The marketing intervention was not, causal in driving that person's behavior, right? People see ads and they also do stuff organically, and those things just happen together, right? So we show these people this analogy that kind of like crystallizes, I think, for people how we think about things, right? That like simply knowing that someone saw an ad and converted doesn't mean that ad was causal or instrumental in driving that person's behavior, right? And that's kind of like the overarching framework, right? The overarching way of thinking about things is we want to isolate and reward marketing channels, campaigns, interventions, whatever you like, for driving those behaviors that would not have happened or were far less likely to happen if that person didn't see marketing, right? Because that's where the real value is, right? So that's kind of like the overarching philosophy or framework in terms of incrementality, right? Is how do we isolate those marketing interventions that are causal to people's change in behavior, right? And our approach or our way of thinking is that experimentation really is the gold standard for thinking about this, right? In terms of the best way to get to like the God's honest truth of the subject is to run an experiment, right? And we run lots of experiments in our team. We run match market tests where we can do another approach which I can talk about in a second. But the reality is that it's really hard to run loads of experiments, the kind of breadth and scale that you want to, especially when we're a global organization, right? We're running marketing in 15 plus countries, right? So we want to get a sense of, we use modeling, we use MMM to help us get this sort of like constant heartbeat to how our marketing is performing across this massive breadth, right? And then we calibrate and we optimize our model, or we improve our model through iteratively experimenting and then using that to calibrate and inform our model, right? So that's our basic approach. It's been a journey, I guess, right? Like we've done things like so many different ways. It's like the journey to this point has been very non-linear, right?
I want to dig into that because I talk to a lot of people who are on this journey. I think most of them are at the earlier stages of this journey, and a lot of them find it quite painful. And whether that's like educating executives about this idea of incrementality when they're used to looking at, touch-based digital tracking attribution methods, and how to pull this together. There's experimentation, there's MMM. Like, can you maybe, I guess, talk a little bit more about that journey, and then also, give advice, like what worked well, what would you do differently on this journey if you were starting over, for other marketers or measurement people who are looking to go on this journey as well?
A great question. So I think for us, the biggest thing is to get buy-in from the people in your organization, right? And the best way to get buy-in from these people is to answer questions or to solve problems that they don't have an answer to, right? Or things that have been really at the forefront of their mind that they've had no way of approaching or thinking about, right? So the biggest win for us was an early experiment that we ran. And our CEO actually said one day, why am I spending so much money on advertising for my own brand name on Google search, right? Why am I bidding on the word Canva so much? Why am I paying so much for that, right? And is it necessary, right? So the first experiment that we ran was to literally answer that question posed by the CEO, right? And we said, like, how can we solve this problem or think about this problem and really generate advocacy and buy-in for how we think about this, right? So we ran an experiment where we tested different bidding reductions for Canva branded terms and found that we could just turn it off. Right? We ran an experiment and we just turned it off. We showed that like if you basically eliminate branded SEM for Canva terms, the organic search result just completely compensates, right? That the organic result just completely carries the users through to the website, and you don't need to pay for Canva branded terms, so we turned it off, right? And that has been sort of like, that was like the cornerstone thing for us, which was like, answer a big business problem, answer a big business question, get the buy-in and then get the trust, and then that will help you get advocates for your way of thinking about things. So before we had this kind of framework of experimentation and modeling, I had no way of answering this question, right? And this just gave the business a little confidence that this approach would head us in the right direction, right? You also need to know love that once. Yeah.
No, I love that story because first of all, it resonates with me. I've gone through exactly that of like branded search has the big question mark. You run the experiment, the results are striking, and it sort of gets the whole organization aligned. And I think I've talked to a lot of other people who have had literally exactly the same channel, same question from the CEO. CEOs hate having to bid on their own brand term. I can tell you this from experience. And so this is like it's a great crystallizing moment. And so I would say like, if you're on this journey as well and you're listening to this, like that is like an awesome experiment to go run, often because the results are interesting. And it's not always the case. I will say that like, it's not always the case that the result is branded search does nothing. I've worked with a number of businesses where branded search actually is highly incremental for them, or at least turning it off does cause their business to drop. And so you do need to go run the experiment to prove it. It does. I think it is incremental in a number of very important cases. But this type of experiment can be so valuable for getting an organization all of a sudden excited about incrementality in really positive ways that I just love the story. And I love that it was also true for y'all.
And I think that there might be a perception for companies, different sizes and maturity, that you need a highly specialized set of tools or equipment or people like data scientists to run that kind of experiment. You really don't, right? Like, as long as you've got someone that has a vague understanding of how these search platforms work and can orchestrate an experiment like that in a platform, or have a contact with the publisher, you can run that kind of experiment and then analyze the result. Any data scientist can analyze those results, right? So you kind of don't need this like massive suite of tools to run the first thing, right? To do the first thing that gets the buy-in to get you on that journey, right? Yeah, a lot of open source packages for doing geolift experiments. The barrier is smaller than you might think it is to get your foot in the door, right? Or to dip your toes in the water, right? So yeah, that was a big step for us.
Big first step. Start off with a bang. Things are going great. The way that you described this journey, it sort of sounded like it was slightly more sinuous after that point. Maybe like what were some of the rough patches that you went through, or where were places where it was like, oh man, it's not all easy from here. I would love to hear again a little bit more about like, what are the hard parts of doing this?
I'll be honest with you. I think that we've been fortunate to work with great partners over the years. We outsource our MMM, right? And I would say that from my perspective, the hardest part hasn't been the modeling, because obviously we outsource it, right? The hardest part is everything around it, right? It's like, I would say, to be honest, the hardest part of running an MMM is now you have the data, you have an organization or a team that doesn't have the muscle or doesn't have the knowledge and experience and the framework for leveraging and utilizing that data and figuring out what to do with it, right? Like, I remember when our first modeling came in and we were just like sitting around a table and going, we've got these curves, we've got these like these rises, these marginal rises, like, so what should we do with it? And we had these like 3 or 4 meetings with finance and going like, oh, we could do this. And like, obviously we got there, right? But like, it took quite a lot of time to figure out like, what exactly do we do with this, right? When we got it,
So this is an interesting topic, because people have described me as insane many times. When I see this and I see like, okay, we see the marginal ROAS, in my mind, I'm like a robot. And I'm like, okay, immediately, all right, we just change the budget and we optimize it so that we find the profit maximizing point on the curve, done. And then I like walk away. But it's very clear that like organizations, that's not actually feasible for organizations. So like, I guess my question to you is like, why? Like, what was the blocker there to like looking at the curves to actually changing the marketing budget?
Yeah, great question. To be honest, I would say that when I first started out, I was like you. I was like, we'll just create this feedback loop between an automated feedback loop between our MMM and the platforms that just optimizes towards whatever the model says, right? And we can just go home after that, right? It just takes care of itself, right? I've learned a lot since that first time. And I would say like the first thing is that I kind of view our role as less about going to finance, going to marketing and saying, do this, spend this. Our role is about communicating trade-offs, right? And MMM is really, really great for communicating trade-offs, right? Because you don't know whether spending for the profit max is necessarily the avenue that your business wants to go down, right? You want to be able to communicate the trade-offs between growth and efficiency, right? It's like, how much do you want to grow and how much do you want to pay for that growth, and being able to clearly present those trade-offs to your finance team, right? Because maybe you're in an organization that has cash to burn and just like really high, has really high growth aspirations, right? And how that company spends might be very different to how a company that's like, we're really constrained, we've got to try and do more with less, we've got to really focus on profitability and profitable spend, right? So I think that like, and to be honest, Canva has fluctuated since I've been there to like different positions or different like attitudes of how we think about things over the course of the last 3 years, right? So to me, it's about, you need that connection with finance to understand, your company's financial situation, its growth aspirations. And, there are also situations where what the model says to do might feel counterintuitive or might feel contrary to what the marketers on the ground are telling you. And that's still valuable information, right? They may say like the cost per trial or the cost per, in the platform is really saying something quite different to what the modeling is saying. Like, what do we do in this situation? We don't want to just blindly trust this model necessarily. So like, maybe we want to calibrate with an experiment. Maybe we want to, or maybe, we're about to launch these new creatives or this new strategy or this platform. We just ran a platform experiment that really showed that like targeting in this different way has like a massive lift. The model might take some time to catch up to that. Maybe we don't want to just like slash the budget or cut the budget of that channel, right? So I think it's about trying to understand, to leverage these different perspectives and to really understand the business, and then help the business communicate clearly to the business what the trade-offs of different investment decisions are, right? And the other thing is like, not all marketing is necessarily designed to drive short-term ROI, right? Like you've got branded spend, which like isn't primarily KPI'd on short-term revenue or user growth. So there's more nuances than simply just spend exactly to the dollar what the model says, right? I think that you need those different perspectives. I think that's been the hardest part, I would say, is figuring out how do we work together and leverage our different perspectives, inputs, subject matter expertises to figure out how we make the most of what we've got. And I think that's been the hardest part, but also where the real impact's been.
There's a lot to love about what you just described. I love the framing of using the model or the models, right? Like there could be different sort of aspects of modeling that are happening here, but really it's about describing trade-offs, right? And helping the business understand and really making concrete the trade-offs that the business might be facing. I mean, I've seen this. I'm sure you've seen it before as well with, less sophisticated businesses. They're like, well, we spent $5 million last year. We're going to spend $10 million next year, and the revenue is going to double because you just, move the formula across in Excel. And that ends up causing a lot of pain in those organizations when that doubling doesn't just magically materialize. And I think getting really rigorous about incrementality really helps give you a better way of thinking, at least thinking about those questions, as opposed to just like, again, the finance people love to just drag the formulas across. But if you don't actually understand incrementality and what the levers of the different marketing channels are, you can end up getting backed into a really nasty corner. One of the other things that it sounds really interesting is the relationship between like analytics / data science and marketing and finance in your organization. Can you talk about like what does good look like there in terms of collaboration across those teams, and how do you help those teams, which at other organizations at least are often at odds? I talk to a lot of CMOs who constantly complain about the finance team, the CFO, and a lot of CFOs who do the same about the marketers. Like, how do you promote good, healthy collaboration when it comes to these trade-off questions across those different groups?
I think like we've gotten better at this over the years as well. And I think that I'll be honest with you, Canva is one of those places where, because people really want to work here, we have the luxury of being fairly selective with who we hire, and we can hire for culture, right? Not every organization has the luxury of being able to hire for culture, right? So I think that it helps that here you can always assume positive intent from everybody, right? And I think that that starting point is really powerful, right? It's like we all want the same things, right? So that makes conversations kind of easier, right? It's like we all want the same thing. We have different ideas of how to get there, but we all want the same thing, right? I think that it's sort of like when we go time to do budgeting for the following year, we sort of have the data team provide if we just spent to exactly what the model said, right? Or, this is what the data suggests that we should do, right? And then that provides sort of like a starting point, right? And then simultaneously, finance and marketing preparing, sort of like what are the strategic principles, or what are the strategic things that we value? What are we trying to achieve? Like, what are our goals, our aspirations, both long and short term? And then we sit down and we just kind of put them together and say, like, where do these things work well together, and where do we need to rethink from both sides? And we just kind of iterate through that. I'd love to tell you that it goes smoothly. We just sort of like wrap it up in half an hour. There's usually lots of back and forth, right? And I said, we're getting better. Like, for example, we started this process in October this year instead of like end of November the year before, which made the end of the year absolute chaos. But yeah, it's kind of like we try and figure out where the strategic stuff, how that intersects with the data, and then say like, and again, it comes back to that trade-offs thing where it's like, if you really value this strategic thing, this is what it's going to cost, or this is what you might give up if you were to invest this money for a profit max situation in another market. And we don't just have, that's the other complex thing, is we don't just have a single market, right? If we were just a company in the US, then the trade-offs become, the degrees of freedom are much smaller, right? But when you're operating across 15 countries, the trade-offs become quite real, right? And Canva has, two different like parallel objectives. Obviously, we want to make money. We're a company, right? We want to make money, but we also have this free product, right? And, the mission statement of the company is to empower the world to design. So we want to get people using the platform for free. We want to seed for the future by getting schools to be using the platform and teachers, so that when they get older and need a design platform in the future, they've had years of experience using Canva. So that becomes another thing, is like, how do we consider this trade-off between making the most money, but also trying to grow this free product that we want? And there's so many dimensions there. And I just don't think you're going to be able to solve a complex problem like that by just doing what the model says, right? So, we just try and figure out where the strategy and the company objectives intersect with what the model's saying, communicate trade-offs, and then go from there. And the good thing about our modeling is it allows us to be flexible, in the sense that we don't lock. I think previously, before we had these kinds of tools that allowed us to see how we're going, we just kind of like chose a budget for the year and just did it. And now we sort of can go, this is working well. This isn't working well. This is, maybe we need to be, we have a monthly meeting where we sit down and talk about like, where could we better invest? How could we be dynamic here? And over time, we're getting better and better at being flexible, right? Before it's like, maybe it's too hard to change this way, or maybe we've got too much momentum in this direction to change. But one of the things that modeling has given us is the courage and the power to be flexible and be dynamic and not feel locked in to a strategy that we chose at the start of the year. And that's really powerful as well.
I love that. I think it really highlights, again, the ability to think about trade-offs and do that in a dynamic way. I mean, you said one thing of like, we obviously don't want to just like follow exactly what the model says, because there's a bunch of other reasonable things that we need to be thinking about. But also, one of the things that's really nice about having a model, and I use model sort of in the generic sense here, like an Excel model does this, but like it gives you a structured way of thinking about a problem. And as you said, thinking about those trade-offs and being able to at least have a reasonable conversation that's based in sort of some sort of structure, as opposed to just like, I'm the CMO, I want to, run TV ads. I'm the CFO, I hate advertising. Like, that's not productive. But like being able to get together and look at some coherent, systematic way of thinking about the world, it can be really powerful to help break out of those deadlocks and say like, okay, we're going to try this and we're going to see how it goes. And then we're going to move on to the other thing. So I really love all of that. I want to change topics slightly. It sounds like y'all have really made the pivot to thinking a lot about incrementality and using experimentation and statistical modeling in order to drive the business. one of the things that can be challenging about making that change is the problem of uncertainty. So one of the nice things, or I'll put nice in square quotes, one of the seemingly nice things about deterministic methods like digital tracking, where it's like first touch attribution or last touch attribution, is that there's no uncertainty, right? It's just like either it's the first touch or it's not, or it's the last touch or it's not, or it's evenly weighted, like very deterministic. You get to an answer on the other side. I think we probably both agree that it's probably the right answer to the wrong question, but it has that very nice property with both experiments, right? Where you have, you're running some experiment, you have to interpret the results on the other side and understand if it's statistically significant or what the range of compatible values are. And media mix modeling obviously comes with a lot of uncertainty because there's lots of degrees of freedom and variables that go into the model. How do you think about communicating that uncertainty to the executive? I know a lot of people that I talk to, like, they really struggle with that. They're like, oh, I want to move our company off of last touch attribution, but my executives hate uncertainty. And so how do y'all think about that? How do you communicate that to your executives? How do you get them to move from a deterministic world into maybe a probabilistic world, or do you?
Yeah, it's a good question. I think the other thing that's really valuable about attribution-based frameworks like last or first touch, whatever you want to use, is it's just so tangible. Like, it's almost like you can reach out and touch it, right? It's just like person clicked on ad, person did this, right? It's so easy to understand, right? It's not a lot of complexity there. And marketers love thinking about things in terms of the user journey, right? They love being able to sort of say like, person saw ad, person came on product, person had this interaction with the product. Like, you can follow them all the way through the journey throughout the funnel, right? And obviously, there's still value in attribution-based frameworks for that kind of thinking, right? But sort of, it was so hard just to get people to think about, they would still use user journey-like language and terminology to describe MMM outputs or MMM worlds, right? And they had trouble abstracting it away to aggregated data, right? And that's hard. Like, it's hard for people to wrap their heads around, especially because MMMs are complicated for statisticians, let alone people who are not from data science or statistics, right? Like, these are complicated things. And another challenge with MMMs, right, is that you often get results and you sort of go like, why? Like, why does it look like that? Why does it, like, what changed here? And there's often not a very good answer, right? Because, last touch allows you to break things down, by like customer profile, segment, all these sorts of things. Whereas MMMs aggregated, it's harder to diagnose, where things have gone off track. Right. So that's a big challenge. And the short answer is like years and years of communication, right? It's not an answer that people like love or want to hear. It's just like repeating the same message in different ways. That's kind of a challenge, right? It's like, how do I really tapping into sort of like, how do I explain this in a way, or find a way of explaining this that's going to resonate with the people that I'm talking about? And especially like when you're working in an organization that has finance people who love to drag the formula across, or who love things like tabulated and itemized on a spreadsheet, and marketers, and then, leadership who have varying degrees of experience with, data science, with marketing, with finance. There's so many different audiences as well. And that presents another challenge. I wish I had a better answer to you than just sort of like, you just really need to find a way to communicate in a language and try different ways of communicating it to help people get over the line.
Were there any like metaphors or anything, like any sort of way of framing it that, at least in your experience, has worked especially well to help people get their heads around these, as you note, like very complicated and often unintuitive topics and ideas?
I went through the pizza analogy before. It's not very helpful, right? But I think that sort of like, one thing that's helped us is being able to say, if we invested in this way, if we execute on this strategy, we think that this is a range of possible outcomes for what could happen, right? And sort of providing this lower and upper bound, right? And finding out, working with them to find out, is that within your risk tolerance, right? So some examples that have come up within Canva is, we really feel like we want to invest more heavily in brand. To do that, we may have to pull back a little bit from performance marketing, right? Because budget's not infinite, right? And they'll say to you like, what might be the revenue or the user growth trade-off to pulling back a little bit from performance and reinvesting and doubling down in brand, because we really want to get this. We really think that the long-term investment is really important here for driving awareness and consideration of our brand, right? And we can say, one, we can tell them how they can pull back in the least impactful way, in terms of we can tell them which channels to take it from so that it minimizes the impact. And then we can say, over this period of time, we think the impact is between this and this, and just providing a range of possible outcomes. And I think that resonates pretty well with basically all audiences, right? It's understanding the best and worst case scenario, knowing that most times it's going to end up somewhere in the middle, right?
Yeah, I love that. And I think, the thing that you're describing, which is what I actually often recommend to people in this situation, is focus on the uncertainty in the business outcome, like the thing that the executives care about, as opposed to uncertainty in some parameter estimates. Because if you're like, oh yeah, the uncertainty around the time shift varies from 7 to 34.7 days with a 90% credible number, it's just like, what are we talking about here?
That goes absolutely without saying, is like, if you try and talk about ad stock, time shift, priors, try explaining prior to somebody. Do you know how hard it is to explain a prior to somebody that doesn't have the vague background in Bayesian modeling, right? If the word prior comes out of your mouth when you're talking to a CMO, you've done it wrong, right? No, guaranteed, you've done it wrong, right? You need to abstract away from the technicalities of the model and talk about it, as you said, concretely in the terms that they care about, right? Because your CMO doesn't care if the uncertainty is because of, a lack of confidence in a time shift parameter, or they don't care about that stuff. What they care about is revenue between X and Y, right? And someone also said something to me once, which was really helpful in how I communicated. They said, think about all the things that you need to be across in your day-to-day job, all the different priorities, all the different streams of work that you are across, right? Now imagine what that's like for your CMO. Imagine what that's like for your CEO, right? Imagine how light touch they have to be on every individual work stream in order to be across the full breadth of it. And that was really crystal. Imagine how many emails you've got unread right now. Imagine what that must be like for the CEO, the CMO, right? They just don't have the time to connect deeply with every single thing that they're across. So you need to say, what are the 4 things? So what is the what, why, and what should I do of this thing? And 9 times out of 10, that's all they want. It's just what is the problem? How are you going to fix it? What is the implication for me? And what do you need me to do, right? What do you need from me? You can abstract all of the complicated modeling down into those things. And that's a really effective way of having good conversations, because trying to explain the ins and outs of your model is just not going to work.
And I think in this, even outside of some complicated statistical model, like a media mix model, even with the results of an experiment, again, taking whatever the outcome of that is, we estimated the lift to be between X and Y, and just convert it into, if we follow this planned budget, here's what the impact of this is, right? And make it into that end of year revenue number, or the end of quarter revenue number, the thing that everyone knows, and sort of use that to create the bounds. That all of a sudden makes the information way more tangible to an executive audience than trying to talk through the p-value was 0.04 and then you have to explain a p-value. It's that's lost. Instead, what is the impact on our forecast for revenue at the end of the quarter? That is a thing that people are going to get and can really, I think, latch onto in a really nice way. And so that's often my recommendation, is get away from the parameters and get towards the outcome as much as possible.
I think that another point that's important to make there is that your ability to do that, to drill it down into things they care about, actually starts so far back in terms of making sure that the KPI that you've chosen for your models connects really as closely as possible to that business outcome, because I think that where we've iterated in the past is metrics is one of the things that we've iterated over quite a few times. Subscriptions are a bit of a complicated animal when it comes to MMMs, because people, unlike e-commerce, people just pay, right? Upfront for their order. They buy socks. They just wish we were a sock company. It'd be way easier if we just sold socks. With subscriptions, right? People they sign up for a trial. You don't know if they're going to pay. And then they're going to cancel it at some undetermined point in the future, right? So we've iterated over our metrics quite a few times, right? But and the key lesson that I've learned from that is your ability to have that conversation with the CMO like 11 months down the track about what they should do, right? Starts with you getting your metric thing right. It starts with you developing a metric or a KPI that's simple, easy to understand, and super closely connected with the thing that you care about. Hopefully you just sell socks and you can just pick revenue, right? But not all businesses are like that, right? Your ability to have that conversation is critically dependent on you picking a metric that allows you to talk in a language that diverse people across your business are going to understand, right? So I said that the modeling for us has been the easiest part. Again, we don't do it, right? But the hardest part's the before and after, right? It's like, what do we do with it? And then how do we categorize our media spend? How do we choose a metric that's really connected and valuable to talking to the business about later? And getting those decisions right is worth iterating over and thinking deeply about before you just do it.
I mean, I think this is very sage wisdom. And honestly, when I've seen a lot of like media mix modeling programs go wrong, and not when they're using Recast, hopefully, but like, I talk to a lot of people, and a lot of the times they make this mistake that you're describing, where they just choose the wrong KPI variable to model against. And it's either something that isn't connected to the business, and so no one uses it, or it's like too far away from marketing, and so it's not actually impacted. But it's a thing that a lot of people overlook. I think especially people who don't come from like a data science background, they're just like, oh yeah, it's the KPI, and it's just like, that's not the important thing. The important thing is the marketing. But actually, you have to get the KPI right, otherwise everything else sort of falls apart. And so I think it's really good advice and worth taking that like extra, however many hours it's going to take to get alignment across the business on like, what is the thing that we are actually trying to inflect? And, is that the right thing to be measuring? And if it's not, like, what is the other thing and what are the trade-offs? Those conversations are super, super important in order for this to be successful. Otherwise, it ends up just going off the rails. This conversation about the complexity of, your business and subscriptions made me think of a sort of a more tactical question. When you're doing some sort of experimentation, whether they're geo experiments or experiments on the platform, how do you think about that in the context of like a subscription event or like a subscription, I guess, like, again, where it's not just like a one-time purchase, there's like quality to these subscriptions, but you're probably only running your experiments over some, medium length to short length of time. Like, how do you bring those pieces together? How do you think about that? Maybe with that like branded search experiment that you run, like, is there a difference in like subscription quality or over time effects that you need to take into account as you're analyzing those results?
Yeah, really good question. So the first time, the early experiments that we ran, our KPI was trials, and cut and dry, the diminishing returns between spend and trial volume, right? But as you pointed out, not all trials are created equally, right? And there's probably also an interesting dynamic between how much you spend and trial quality, right? So you get diminishing returns in terms of for every dollar that you spend, you get less trials back. But for every dollar that you spend, it might be the case that the quality of those trials also diminishes with additional spend, right? Because you're reaching audiences potentially with less use cases or so on and so forth, right? So that's where we started. Where we iterated to is we have an internally developed model that estimates a machine learning model that estimates the value of a trial it used to be actually on the day that the trial was struck. We found that delaying that estimate by about a week makes a huge difference to predictive accuracy because knowing what people do in the first week is quite telling in terms of, do they just cancel straight away? Did they like complete one use case and then never use it again? Or are they using it consistently over the course of the trial? But the machine learning model tells us for every trial, what do we expect to return over some window of time? Currently it's 6 months, right? Because the longer that you try to estimate in terms of like 12 months forever, the quality of the prediction diminishes over time with longer prediction windows. But yeah, we estimate how much each trial is worth, and then that allows us to understand that relationship better than just using raw trials. So things like what country is a trial from, what device the trial is struck on. So on average, for example, we make a lot more money from, $2,000 iPhone trials than we do from, $7 Android phones, right? So yeah, that model allows us to reward channels which drive the highest value trials, essentially, because not all trials are created equal.
I love it. I've seen other companies do similar things, so I think that makes a lot of sense, but it sort of highlights the complexity here. Like even a sort of simple experiment, like it requires this amount of machinery to get it right, because otherwise you can get misdirected. You could say like, oh, this channel drives a ton of trials really efficiently, but if you forget to account for trial quality, like you could end up making the wrong decision. So I think it really highlights that. The last thing that I wanted to talk about was, you mentioned you outsource your media mix model. I'm curious, like, how do you do that? Like, how do you outsource it and then know that it's good? How do you think about finding the right partner? Like, is there any way that you can talk about like how y'all think about finding that partner, making sure that the quality is actually good, and then like being able to really use that for the internal trade-offs and decision-making that you're actually doing practically with those results?
Yeah, I mean, the alternative that you left out is doing it yourself, right? Like building it internally, right? And there's obviously Robin, like Meta's MMM package. You can build pretty rudimentary MMM in Excel if you're really keen. I guess like in terms of like the build versus buy, first of all, it's like, what do you want to spend your time doing, right? Like how do you want to invest your data science resources, right? I find it much more impactful to be connected to the business case, right? Which is like, let somebody else worry about this incredibly complicated statistical problem, which could easily absorb like all of our time and energy into just making it run. Or do we want to be spending our time talking to people, connecting it to business cases and actually driving impact for the business, right? So we thought a lot about that. And we're like, well, where do we want to be spending our time? Like, and if we build an MMM, we're going to build it once and then we're just going to run it till the end of time, right? We're not going to we're not going to be able to invest significant resources into making it better, to optimizing it, to like reading the current research, keeping up to date with industry trends. Like no one's resourced for that, right? I don't think at our scale, at least. So we thought that we'd like to be more connected to the outputs from the model than the inputs to the model, right? Or to machinery of running the model, right? So that was first thing, right? Choosing an MM provider, that's hard, right? Like, and I think you'll find that whenever you talk to an MMM provider, they will tell you that their way of thinking about it is the right way and everybody else is wrong, right? And
Definitely.
yeah, and the question is like, can they defend that statement, right? So when we went about choosing an MM provider, we came up with a challenge exercise, essentially, which was like, we've got some data. We've got, it's all prepped and ready in terms of like, it's in an appropriate format for you to start modeling. It's not like, it's not, we didn't just give you a bunch of raw data and say, go ahead. Like we've categorized, come up with a high modeling hierarchy. We've got a KPI that we're thinking of using, and can you model it for us and see like, and then present the results back to us, right? And I'll tell you, in those meetings or in those situations where we went back, the thing that we cared least about was the ROI, right? Like, ignore that. That's irrelevant, right? For the purposes of choosing the right vendor, right? Because the question is like, how can they prove or how can they show you that these predictions are reasonable? So you're looking for things like, can they show you forecast accuracy? Are they willing to be transparent in terms of what they show you from the model, right? Like some vendors are very cagey at what they show you. They just show you some curves and they show you the data and everything under the hood's a bit proprietary, right? We don't want to show you that stuff. Yeah, I think like, can they show you forecast accuracy? Can they show you, and are they transparent with the rigor in which they've gone to estimate these things? And you can really tell by the questions they ask you, right? I think that's like, aside from the outputs, like a good MMM vendor is so thoughtful with like the questions that they ask you, because the reality of modeling, right, is that you're trying to estimate like hundreds of parameters from very scant data, right? Like you might be trying to estimate stuff from like 800 rows of data, like just like, it's really not that much data. And like, so, and this is something that people can find uncomfortable, is like, there's quite a lot of what the modeler does and decisions that modelers make along the process have quite a large influence over the final result, right? And you want to make sure that you pick a provider that's thoughtful and structured and transparent with what those decisions are, because that has such a massive influence over what the model is that you get, right? And so I think that like for us, it was like, model validation and transparency around what you get shown, but also like you can just tell who the good vendors are from how thoughtful and structured they are with what they ask you about your media plan, and can communicate clearly what the impacts of those decisions will be on your final model, right? What you don't want is a vendor that says, oh, that's the data. Thank you. We'll be back in 2 weeks, right? Like,
I mean, it would be nice if it were that easy, right? That would be great, ideally.
It is appealing from like a let's move quickly perspective, right? But yeah, there's just it's too hard it's too easy to make a poorly specified model is, I guess, the biggest challenge in MMM methods. Is like anybody with a keyboard and a dream can make a poorly specified MMM, right? So I think that, yeah, it's like those conversations, like what are they asking you? What are they, how carefully are they trying to understand your business and what you do? And what are the decisions that the user or the modeler is going to make when they build your model, and like what impact is that likely to have on your business? And then also on the outcome of the model. And then, how well can they reproduce the results over different training windows? How well does the model forecast in terms of in 90 days we predict the revenue will be this? What did we actually backtest against? All those sorts of things. I think that like that's what gives you the confidence, because if I don't have the confidence in the model, I am the person that is the vendor's representative to the rest of the organization. And for me to advocate for it, I need to be confident, because if I'm confident, then I can speak confidently when I go up in front of my CMO and all those sorts of people, right? So I think that and the confidence that I have really allows me to stand up in front of those people and speak confidently.
I love that. I think it's really like helpful tactical advice. I think there's a lot of marketers out there that think they need something like this, but it's, they're marketers. They're not statisticians. They don't know how to evaluate these complicated models. But I think some of what you're talking about transparency and rigor and different ways of actually validating the results, as opposed to like, give us the data set, and something comes out the other end in 18 days. Like, I think that's really helpful tactical advice. So that's great. We're keeping an eye on the clock here. We're running low on time. Any other last like words of advice, words of wisdom for people on the brand side, practitioners that are, again, sort of thinking about this journey? Anything else that you would recommend or share with them as they are, maybe on sort of a little bit earlier on this journey than Canva is today?
Firstly, there's a lot of great content out there, right? Like, we're fortunate. This
podcast, for example.
This podcast, for example. There's a lot of great content out there. I've also had people over time like reach out to me and say like, hey, we're thinking about doing this. Can we chat? People are like surprisingly willing to help like other companies like do these sorts of things. Like talking to someone who's gone through it before, understanding the pitfalls and like, about where what's been challenging, what's not, what's been easy, like what mistakes could you avoid is super helpful. I think being patient as well, like you're just not going to change it's like turning the Titanic around in some situations, which is like kind of like a scary metaphor, right? Like maybe not the Titanic. Let's go to another vessel that didn't sink, right? It's like trying to turn a large vessel around, right? In iceberg-free waters. It takes time. It's not something you can pivot straight away. So, focus on building trust, focus on small wins. And I imagine that if, running an MMM is like too challenging or too daunting, or you're not resourced for it, like there's a lot of things that you can do with experiments that could have enormous impact on your business, right? That are massive lifts, right? And just start there, start small, find the most impactful questions that you can answer and do that.
Don't overcomplicate it. I think I give this advice a lot. Like, you don't need an MMM. Like, start running some experiments, just make some changes, see what happens. You should be rigorous about it, but overcomplicating it actually like often makes it worse. And then there's more stuff to explain to the executives. It's hard to bring them along. Just echoing back to that sort of catalyzing experiment that you mentioned at first, like, do we have to be paying so much for branded search? Let's go test it. Like, that is just a great place to get started. So I love that advice. I think that's wonderful. We're out on minutes.
One other thing that I would add, just very carefully, is like attribution loves branded search, right? Like, that's not to say that, as you said before, don't just turn off branded search. Like, for a lot of businesses, it is really impactful and you should do it, right? But attribution loves branded search, right? It loves search in general, right? So just be mindful that like, just because something's driving a lot of traffic to your website doesn't necessarily mean it's driving a lot of business value, right? The only other small piece of advice that I thought of is like, one of the most powerful things about this shift towards incrementality is it's completely changed the conversations that we have with our publishers, right? Before, whenever a publisher comes to, it's like, hey, I think you should spend more money. Like a lot of our conversations are so much about budget and spending more, right? And now our conversations are just like, guys, this, we're going to be making our own budget decisions. It abstracts spending and budget decisions away from the publishers, right? And allows you to take that power yourself. And then your conversations with the publishers are more around, how can you help us run better ads, right? That's so powerful, being able to have those conversations with publishers and say, like, we're not going to talk about budget. I want you to tell me, how can I run better ads? I've got so much infrastructure and so much engineering and stuff to help you run better ads. That's what you want to be talking to your publishers about. Don't talk to them about money.
Ask them, how can you help me actually drive the business forward? That's like that's such a more productive conversation to have.
So much more.
I love that. Yeah. All right. It is the end of my day and the beginning of your day. So it is time to wrap up this conversation. Matt, this has been so great. Really, really deep on a bunch of different topics, both on like statistics and modeling, but also most importantly around organizational. How do we actually use these things? How do we use this to actually make the business better? How do we bring executives along? So, I think it's going to be super valuable for the listeners. Thank you so much for the time. Really appreciated having you. And yeah, have a great beginning and rest of your day.
Thanks so much, Michael.